All right, so today I'm Mary Kaufman, and I'm an interpreter at Humboldt Redwoods State Park. And today we're talking with Dave Stockton. It's November 20th, 2019, and we're going to talk a little bit today about the floods, the history of floods in Humboldt Redwoods State Park and the area, and what led up to them, and then the after effects.
Okay, well, there were the 55 and 64 flood were the major points, but there were also events around those two that influenced the environment. There was a high water in 1953 from Scotia north. The brunt of the storm hit north of here, but brought the Eel River up pretty high in the park. 1954 there was a 6.5 earthquake which shook a lot of the ground loose in Bull Creek, which the old timers said really started the erosion. I think what started the erosion was cutting all the trees, but that's my opinion, because they did strip the countryside. The 55 flood was a real wake-up call. There had been a flood in 1937, which was one of those that people brushed off. Railroad was closed down for most of the winter. Their water was about 3 to 4 feet deep in Pepperwood, and Wyatt about the same, the edge of Myers Flat. I don't have any official coverage for Bull Creek, but the 55 flood was the one that really began the watershed collapse. And from 1947 to 1954, that 7-year span, the hillsides were almost completely denuded. They had cut so many trees. They had a reload at Panther Gap where they would bring off the highway logging trucks, and they would haul the logs and drop them off at Myers Flat, load them on legal trucks, and then haul them to the various mills where they were going. It wasn't usually a very long haul. The first mill was right there in Bull Creek. The second one was in Red Crest, also a plywood mill. Metropolitan was the third one. Pacific Lumber didn't cut fir, and when they ran into a fir, they usually sold it to someone else. But 1955 caused this huge movement of fill in the stream beds downstream through Rockefeller Forest and out into the Eel River. There were some places that the fill was 8 and 9 feet deep through Rockefeller Forest, which caused the loss of 300 trees. Like I say, it was a real shock. Park had hired contractors to kind of clean up, and sad thing was there were bulldozers at Bull Creek pulling the trees out, and they were stacking them at Dyerville, and then the lumber companies come out and bid on the trees to cut them up for lumber.
So they lost 300 redwood trees.
Right, in Rockefeller, yeah. Yeah, there's hardly any fir trees in Rockefeller. A few, but not many.
And that's why they're not there today, because they were taken out?
Yeah.
I always wondered that, because you don't really see a lot of down trees.
No, you
along
don't.
There.
If you walk, you can walk the trails, but to really get an insight, walk the stream bed, and then go a little ways inside the stream bed, and you can see where some were cut that they were going to lose anyway. There's a whole huge file of flood pictures in Bull Creek. And like I say, it was so sad to see all these heavy equipment, carryalls, bulldozers in Bull Creek. And of course, what was the solution? Well, they started off with gabions, which were metal cages filled with rocks. and they were stacked alongside the bank. And
Was the idea that this would continue to happen every
Yeah.
year
Yeah.
when the rains came?
And this they put up against the soft banks to stop the erosion. It didn't work because the rainstorms were such that if you heavy rain, the creek would get up and either above or behind the gabions, and they would collapse. So that didn't work. Cribbing, that didn't work. Cribbing is stacking of kind of like Prestologs or these log cabin kits that you can get. That didn't work because the same way it was such an active watershed, and water would get up, and of course the soil was highly soluble and would erode very easily. The only thing that did work were rock cribbing. Not cribbing. But anyway, a whole section of rock stacked against the bank. And of course the park was a long time in denial. They did not want to rock both sides of the creek for 5.5 miles. The expense was out of sight. And of course, Save the Redwoods, they bailed them out, came in, helped them out. Riprap, that's the term for rock. And so they started the process, and they worked from Albee Creek, where the entrance to Rockefeller was, and started riprapping along both sides of the bank, all the way to the mouth. This took several years. You can go into Rockefeller today and you can find little old access roads that the dump trucks would haul rock down to the creek, and then they were put in place by a crane. In the meantime, one of the failures was, it's kind of hilarious in a way, was reef barriers. And someone had this wonderful idea: if you slowed the water down before it got to Rockefeller, it wouldn't erode as much going slowly through the park. And so they made a series, almost like stair steps, of this
Was it concrete? Or?
Yeah, they were concrete pieces that interlocked.
Okay.
And reef barrier was the term for them. So they had about 3 or 4 of these reef barriers. Well, behind that...
In Cuneo Creek?
No, this was in Bull Creek itself, right at the mouth of Albee Creek.
Okay.
So behind these, they put a series of rocks just out in the middle of the creek, just stacked them out in the middle of the creek, like 7 or 8 rows of them. And of course they weren't just rocks, they were energy dissipators. How's that for putting a fancy dress on a pig? But anyway. And of course the irony was they built this whole structure in 1963. See, now you catch on to this, you figured this out. So the storm comes in 1964, they go in, everything's buried. You can't find one rock, you find a couple little pieces of the structure, and that's about it. And it ended up all the way down past the bridge. So that idea kind of got forgotten. Went back to the riprap. And this, I'm trying to think, it was, when they finished it was 1968 or 69. And of course it stopped the erosion. Now, with every little gain they made, they had a little loss, because when they built this riprap structure, it was in a trapezoid shape, and then a big flat along the creek. Well, they got the bulldozers in and they pushed all this gravel that filled in the creek as much off to the side, and stacked it up against where the bank had cut. And you can still see that. That's something we need to see. You can still see where this old original bank was. And they've backfilled it with gravel. And then, of course, they put the rock on the front of that. Well, it was one of those good news, bad news scenarios. It did stop the erosion, but also flushed out all the fines, and all the fines were where salmon would dig and spawn. So as the years went by, the gravel was coarse, and you had rocks like this and bigger. And so I was conducting some walks with Fish and Wildlife personnel, and I was so alarmed because this great big redwood fell off the bank there at Squaw Creek. And Ruth Goldfield was her name. She was a Fish and Game employee. And she says, "What's going on?" I said, "Well, a tree just fell." "Oh, let's go out and look at it." So we went out and looked at it. She was excited. "Oh, this is wonderful." I said, "How can you say that? That's a 9-foot diameter tree. There's 1,500 years of growth gone." "Oh, no," she said. You watch. And so we walked down the length of that tree, and it was piling up fine gravel. This is what the salmon needed. And it was right by the mouth of Squaw Creek, so couldn't have been more perfect where it fell. And it did make some spawning habitat. So then that fired me up, and I did a survey. I walked full length of Bull Creek in Rockefeller Forest and wrote down the drift that was in the creek, potential spawning as the creek went down, what would make a spawning hole, and out of 5.5 miles, I think I found 5, which was horrible to me. Maybe in the future these would...
Right, because of
all the fill out of
the riprap and...
Yeah. And then saving all the coarse stuff and all the fine stuff washing away. But anyway, I'm getting off the subject. A 55-foot, like I say, 300 trees. And of course, the philosophy back then was, if you've got enough chainsaws and bulldozers, you can fix anything. And that's how the problem was attacked. The trees were cut out of the stream beds, hauled down to Dyerville. There was also in Bull Creek, and nowhere else, in January 1956, there was another flood. And Bull Creek had experienced over 50 inches of rain in January of '56, and this just increased the erosion. It was really bad. Well, like I say, the park and say the Redwoods League, thinking this is the remedy to the problem, brought bulldozers, and of course they had to redo Cuneo Creek Bridge. They had to redo Bull Creek Bridge, the one that's in Rockefeller. Bridge number 2, they had to redo that too. So anyway, they were in a repair mode, and salvage and repair. They didn't, like I say, they took all the trees out.
You say they were sold?
Yeah. The lumber companies come in and bid on the trees. Highest bidder got.
And that wasn't against, I assume, any kind of policy?
Well,
to keep the policy now is to keep so much of
that. But that was a state of emergency back then. And so. And
did when the '64 flood came?
Same thing.
How many more trees were lost, or did the riprap they had already put up, did that help?
It helped a lot, yeah. But there were still areas that didn't heal completely. And I know shoe fly for one, that's a lot of erosion there, and a lot of trees. And then the horseshoe, there was and they took a lot of that's when they had to carry all in the creek, and he would just scoop up gravel and he would take it and he dumped it around that horseshoe. You ever been that Bull Creek Trail south? There's a big opening right in the middle, and you can see where the creek used to make a semicircle.
I've been on the trail, but
it's off the trail, but you can see it from the trail. Well, anyway, they hauled all this fill in there, and it went along with their repaired the riprap that got destroyed, that let go, and
were many more trees taken down?
Quite a few. I don't know. There was a number somewhere, and it was, I've heard as high as 500. I've heard as low as 200, but somewhere in between.
So about the same potentially
Probably,
as 55.
yeah, probably about the same.
That's a lot of loss.
Yeah, it was, and it just made a big scar right down Bull Creek.
So since the 64 flood and when they repaired the riprap, have they done anything else to Bull Creek, or just time will...
Well,
did they bring back any gravel
here's
for the salmon?
the strange situation of it all. The attention got focused on Cuneo because that was still eroding terribly and putting a lot of fill into Bull Creek. And of course they couldn't flush this out, it was flushing it out, pieces at a time, when the water would come up. But the energy was focused on Cuneo Creek because they think if they could stabilize Cuneo Creek, that would stop all the erosion from filling into Bull Creek. So for the next decade, up until the mid-70s, we were pulling stumps out, trying to get the flow going and then flush this stuff out and flush it through the system. The big irony was, when I came back here in the 90s, I also volunteered for Fish and Wildlife. And so one of the game wardens, Scott Dowdy, he was a pretty neat guy. They had fish days out in Bull Creek, and so he would be out there, and so I would stop, Dan and I would stop, we'd visit with him, and so he said, "Where'd all the stumps go?" I said, "You ought to know, you told us to take them out in the 60s, we took them all out." "Oh, no, now they need to be back in here." I said, "You have to make up your mind, what do you want, because this is what we were supposed to do, and this is what we did." And so now it's back on putting obstacles in the creek to form fishing holes. In the 60s it was to flush all this stuff out of there and to get it out. So like I say, the flood really impacted Bull Creek a lot. And of course this publication probably had something to do with it. Started the governor's mandate to acquire the Bull Creek watershed to protect Rockefeller Forest. And of course, methods were discussed, and one method was just condemn the place. And I say the Redwoods, they said, "No, that's not morally right. We will raise the money and pay all of these ranchers fair market value for their property. Still going to have to leave, but we will pay them fair market value for their property," which they did. And of course it took several years by the time they got everyone on board and bought all the properties. But in the meantime, as a member of the park staff, spent a lot of time working out at Bull Creek and at Cuneo Creek. And we were trying to correct, get the ground stabilized. And nothing we did worked, especially Cuneo. That just come off those hillsides like you wouldn't believe. So we had kind of just did all we could and expected the worst every time winter came, because more erosion would happen. Panther Creek was pretty bad. Cuneo was the worst by far. Well, anyway, in the mid-70s I left the park and went to work in a sawmill. I still kept in touch with what was going on here, hiked out in the woods. In 1992 I came back and got involved with the association. So after a few months being on the board of directors, I decided, I better go out and look at the park. I haven't hiked some of these trails in years. So I started with Bull Creek, and of course I got lost. It changed so much. Vegetation had grown. It still looked like crap underneath. All the erosion, you could still see that, but at least had a covered canopy, a canopy to cover it, and then the understory would start developing, and stabilizing the ground. So I was really impressed with that, because 1964 we figured it was all over with. You know, it just tore through that country like you wouldn't believe. Not only Bull Creek, but you had Weot, you had Pepperwood, Myers Flat, just stripped Phillipsville, stripped the countryside bare. And homes, 2/3 of the buildings were gone. Structures were just washed away. So Pepperwood, the city fathers all got together and said, sell it back to the park. We've had enough flooding. And so there are a few hangers on, there still are, but you know, basically the park got most of the property there in Pepperwood. And it was devastating.
Did the park ever try and get Red Crest homes, Myers Flats? I mean, the towns that are still in existence today with the park surrounding them, I mean, why are they still there? Did the park not want them?
No, they didn't. In 1995, there began an Avenue of the Giants plan from the county. And so we alerted all the communities along the Avenue of the Giants, you know, we were going to conduct a plan and lay out what needs to be done here in the next 20 years. Well, ironically, the state park they were thinking about doing a Avenue of the Giants plan of their own. So my motivation for getting involved with this county plan was to get the state in on it, and we would have half the meetings, half the expense, and get the plan done for both. Because when we started the county plan, and of course you go to each community, and the number one priority on their agenda is keep the park from getting any bigger. We don't want any more park. We don't need any more park. You know, that was their number one priority, which that's fine. You know, park was doing well. Our last priority was kind of getting some of these watersheds that were unprotected. And so Bull Creek was pretty much complete. Pepperwood, that was all we wanted on. We didn't really want the property in Pepperwood. You can see various places in Pepperwood have been replanted. And, that was about it. Myers, we never bothered with Myers. Miranda was out of the floodplain. Phillipsville, that was, yeah. It was...
Red Crest?
No, Red Crest was out of the floodplain. So it was already surrounded. Pacific Lumber donated property from Red Crest to Jordan Creek to the park. They've been trying to sell it to the park for years, and the park wouldn't buy it because it was full of spike tops and rotten trees. And so the park never bought it. So finally they donated in 1968. And,
Interesting.
I know. And then they logged a bunch of it because it was full of rotten trees by the Bartow place there in Pepperwood. But,
okay. Kind of got off topic, but I always wondered. I always wondered about that. So I was just curious: were there any studies done about salmon? Like there are a lot of years from like 53 through a few years past the 60s, 64 flood, where it seems like no salmon was going to get up Bull Creek.
No, and there were not per se studies done. The last really good fishing year was 1954 on the Eel River, and that was a bonanza year. 55 flood kind of knocked everything out. And like I say, the irony of having all those equipment bulldozers in Bull Creek, a native brown trout was lost that lived in Bull Creek, and it was never seen after the 55 flood, which to me is a tragedy. But the only salmon restoration done in Bull Creek up till the 70s were employees sneaking up spawners up Bull Creek and Burns Creek. I don't think anybody tried anything at Cuneo because it was too far gone. So there were actually steelhead salmon going up Bull Creek in the 70s, but because these employees had sneaked them up there, we're planting them in there. So
Do you know what the state of the watersheds in the creek is now considered?
oh, now it's much better. You know, it still looks pretty bad underneath, but there's a nice canopy now, and the ground vegetation is getting restored. That's something you need to go out and see.
So, is it restored a lot because of just nature and time,
Right,
or
right.
did it really need that? Was it crucial to have that riprap initially? Like, if that hadn't been put down, it might never.
Yeah, it served its purpose, but a lot of the land healed itself. That was the most shocking thing to me when I started hiking around the park, how much it had healed. And, you know, they run out of money. Park didn't have any money. You know, the league bought up all this equipment, and they kind of lost interest too, because it started healing itself. And it was just mind-boggling to me, the progress that it made. There was still erosion here and there, you know, bad things, and left over from what the flood started. You know, the '64 flood, water got pretty high. See, in 1955 it was 17 feet deep in Weot. It was 33 feet deep in '64. So that's quite a difference. And it actually got up to this wall out front here. It was 5 feet deep in the visitor center.
How long did that last? Was that?
That was another rarity. It stayed up for 24 hours. And normally on the Eel River, as soon as it crests, it goes right back down. But it stayed up for 24 hours, which just was amazing.
And then, before it actually sort of was a lot closer to the actual riverbed. I mean, before it was away from the homes and things like that.
Yeah, it took a couple of days.
A couple days.
Yeah.
So how are the watersheds as well? The Bull Creek's done a lot of healing, but like Cuneo and
I don't know if Cooney's ever going to heal.
Albee Creek, they're still.
Yeah, Albee's all right. Albee's in good shape, and that's a pretty steep watershed too. Cow Creek is pretty well. I haven't been that far up Harper Creek. Squaw Creek is beautiful, and mainly because there were big boulders up there, because a lot of that, the splitters went through there, and there was logging up in Squaw Creek, but the boulders along the creek stabilized the banks of the creek, so there wasn't much erosion. There was a little bit here and there, but Squaw Creek was pretty stable.
How did the 55 and 64 flood affect the giant tree?
Oh, there's an unofficial story. 1964, 1955, there was a log bridge that had a railing on one side, like 120 feet long, and it went from the parking area side across the creek onto the Bull Creek side. It was pretty close to the Flatiron tree. 55, it washed the supports it was laying down. But the erosion got way in and got fairly close to the giant tree. In 1964, it got right by the giant tree, and there's an unofficial story to come down that one of the loggers took his cat over there, drove across the creek and parked in front of the giant tree to break the current, and it actually saved the giant tree. And I tried my best to find out who it was, and nobody wanted to say that they helped the park out, because the park was a bitter enemy back then. So I never did find out who officially it was. But if you go to the giant tree today, you can see where the erosion was, because the trees are very small up to pretty close to the giant tree, and then they're big again. And so like I say, I never did find out who it was.
What about Founder's Tree? How did that fare during the
Oh,
the
no
64?
problem. It flooded. You know, water was